Let's go for another GTO Wizard weekly coaching today. Hope you're all good. Hope you have been having a good week. And hopefully we can learn something together here again. All right, see some familiar faces here. Glad to have you all here. And let's begin today's weekly coaching. For today, we're going to discuss a topic which was suggested by one of the members in GTO Wizard Weekly Coaching's channel. And there were a lot of very good suggestions. So I would like to talk about some of those first. So Josette, or Josette, I don't know how to pronounce, suggested for us to talk about how to identify pure strategies and mix strategies with certain combos. I thought it was a very, very good topic, very good suggestion. However, I didn't have enough time to prepare something that I would find good enough for the weekly coaching. So this one is going to have to be another time, but we're definitely going to tackle that because certainly very interesting and very important. So the combination of these two things make it so that we certainly have to talk about that. So very good suggestion by our friend, but it's not going to be today. Bunjo one suggested flapjack raises from big blind on different textures versus small c-bet. I also thought it was a very good suggestion. However, it's something that it's simpler than the other suggestions. So maybe we can cover that in the future when we don't have anything else that is as relevant as the other things. But certainly a very good suggestion as well from Bunjo. The one that got more likes was the one from Hedberg, which is deep stack adjustments pre-flop. And it is a good suggestion. However, I wouldn't feel comfortable giving advice on this because I haven't really studied much deep stack play, both pre-flop and post-flop. My focus has always been on studying 100 big blinds, so I wouldn't feel very comfortable giving advice. It would be mostly me just browsing sims with you guys, which is probably not the best use of everyone's time. If in the future I have more confidence in giving advice on this, then we can definitely return to this topic. Right, so the one that I think was the most relevant for today is suggestion for Alessandro, which is tiny bets on the river, 10% bets on the river. And this is a very, very interesting topic because it allows us to understand some properties of the equilibrium, and it allows us to expand our current understanding of the game as well. So I thought it was a pretty good opportunity to discuss some of those concepts. Right, so that's what we're going to have for today. Please keep coming with the suggestions in the GTO Wizard channel. I'm always going to be reading through those and bringing whatever you guys feel is the most relevant, what you guys like the most, provided that I do have the confidence to bring that topic. For today, if I were listening to the most liked suggestion would be the deep stack pre-flop stuff, but that specifically, I don't feel very comfortable sharing any knowledge because I don't have many or don't have much knowledge on that. Right, so let's begin for today. And before we jump into the simulations and discuss the concepts, I want to hear from you guys in the chat. Have you ever used 10% bets on the river in your own game? If not, or if yes, what is the theoretical explanation for those bets? So what do you guys think? What would be your hypothesis for what is a theoretical explanation for the existence of very tiny bets on the river? Let's begin with that, and then we can move on to some examples and try to understand the mechanics behind those interactions. It should make up for a very interesting discussion. All right, so do you guys use it? Regardless of the answer, why you think it's a thing sometimes? And I'm going to share my screen so that we at least have something to take a look while you're answering. And let me put this here. All right. I'm going to share this. All right. So you should be seeing my screen, browser with GTO Wizard. This is the first answer here from Rob Boss. I've always used for thin value. Interesting. So I've always used as small as 10% sizing. That's cool. Not many people use those. Matthias said never used. DV of checking and betting super small OPs very close. That will almost always be true just because of the nature of the sizing. But we're going to see that there's a lot of interesting theoretical concepts that go on in there and some exploitative considerations that is going to make it for a very good exploit. Stephen said not very often. Right. What about hypothesis for why is it a thing? So yeah, just joined, said Manuel. So we're going to be talking about tiny bets on the river. Tiny bets, 10% pot bets on the river. And the first question that I asked is, do you guys use it? Have you ever used it? And regardless of whether you have used it or not, what would be your hypothesis for why it's actually a thing sometimes at equilibrium? Stephen said that he uses sometimes as an exploit. Nice. What are you trying to exploit when you use a very tiny bet on the river? If you can be more specific. João Oliveira said, we need to have our range protected with strong hands that make sense to enter that bet size. I think in many situations it makes sense because villain won't find enough raises. Right, so. Well, in the second part of your answer, you're giving mostly an exploitative reasoning, right? So people are not going to find enough raises. That's going to increase the EV of some hands in the range that would allow to bet that sizing. But in the first part of your answer, it's more of a theoretical explanation that, or at least a theoretical requirement, right? So you have to have some nuts in there to avoid getting raised all the time. And then those two things don't go together, right? So if people are not raising enough, then it would probably not be a good idea for you to use that size at the top of your range, right? Because then they're not generating enough value for you. They're not putting enough money into the pot for you. But the two things you said certainly make sense. Max said never used it, but when you have a range of medium strength hands out of position and both players have nuts in range. Right, so one of the requirements in your opinion would be that we have middling hands and that both players have nuts in range. Why both players need to have nuts in range? Rob Boss said, I didn't realize this was out of position. I used the sizing as a blocking bet with my medium strength hands looking for showdown. Nice. Yeah, so IP, you're almost never going to see blocking bets from an equilibrium perspective. I didn't even mention that we were going to be talking about out of position, but you guys probably already know that IP, these bets are almost never going to happen simply because, well, the benefit of those bets is non-existent when you're IP. When you're IP, you can just check back and realize EV versus the hand you're already ahead of. So the only benefit that it would have would be if your opponent is lacking raises to the point where you can just reopen thinner for value, right? So we're mostly going to be talking out of position, but it's fine to use it as an exploit IP sometimes. That certainly is true. Sometimes in live play, betting that small can induce a large raise from villain. Nice. So depending on your opponent's tendencies, you can use that as an exploit to trick him into putting more money into the pot, right? That's certainly a thing, especially against aggressive recreationals. I think this can be a thing. Max said you need nutted hands to protect your small betting range, and when villain has lots of nutted hands, Your middling strength hands cannot bet very large. Right. But it's almost like one answers the other, right? So if villain has a lot of nutty hands, then it's not possible for most of your hands to be very strong, right? You're gonna have to have middling or weak hands because we're saying that villain has a lot of nuts. And obviously, middling strength hands cannot really put too much money into the pot. So nice. So a lot of different answers, some different perspectives. A lot of you answering exploitative considerations, which is nice. It's not like we're focusing on exploits here, but it's certainly a part of this discussion, and we're gonna talk about that a lot today. Manuel said, kind of block bet where OP has to pay it off very often. We prevent some bluffs. We prevent some bluffs this way that we can't pay off. What do you mean exactly? I think I got your idea, but I'm not sure 100%. We prevent some bluffs this way that we can't pay off. So you're saying that with that very small bet, we are avoiding the option to check and then face a bet which we cannot call, right? I guess that's the main idea there. We're definitely going to talk a lot about that because it has to do with what's going on here. So let's move on to the first example. And you're going to see that we have some, we have two sets of different examples that it may seem counterintuitive, but later when we take a look at the distribution for both ranges, we're going to see why it's happening on both of these types of scenarios. Right, so one thing that I like to always think about when I'm studying equilibrium is not focus necessarily on the line on the board or variables that are not necessarily determinant to the strategy. What I want to look is the equity distribution for both ranges. So it's what I call a distribution matchup. So what's the distribution for the OP player? What's the distribution for the IP player? Once you know the distribution of both ranges, then understanding the equilibrium is much easier. It makes a lot of sense. When you're not looking at equilibrium from that perspective, it gets way harder. It gets much more difficult, or it's not very clear why certain strategies are the way they are. So we're going to focus a lot on understanding what kind of distribution makes sense for that strategy to exist. So that's my first question for you guys. Some of you have already answered something close to that, but let's try to be really specific or try to really imagine what would be a kind of distribution matchup in which betting very small makes sense in order for us to maximize our EV. So what the two ranges need to look like in order for this to make sense in you guys' own intuition now that we still haven't explored? It's totally fine to not know it for sure for now, but what would be the type of distribution for both ranges that you feel like, well, with these distributions, then I think it would make sense? And then try to talk about the amount of air in both players' ranges, the amount of middling hands, the amount of nuts. At least these three categories need to be in your mind. So amount of air, amount of nuts, amount of middling hands. Max answered, OP has 5% nuts, 95 middling hands. IP has 25 nuts, rest air. Probably that distribution is gonna end up being pure check for OP, right? So OP has 95 minion hands, and 5% only nuts is such a small number that if IP has any kind of nuts, he's going to want to bomb into that range, right? So if IP has 25% nuts, even though it has 75% air, because of the very low amount of air in out of position, then IP is just going to bomb the biggest possible size into that range, which greatly benefits the out of position nuts. right? Because IP's bluffs are always going to, or they're going to also bump into the pot to balance IP's value bets. So probably that distribution is going to come up with OP checking all strong hands or not all nutted hands, and therefore checking all of the medium hands as well. Rob Boss, SB would have equity advantage on all or most of the range to create this strategy. Equity advantage is a concept that is important, but it doesn't really paint the picture that we need to derive the strategy, right? When we say a certain range has equity advantage, all we're saying that in the aggregate, if you weight all of the different combos in the range and sum up their equities, then this range has a little bit more than this range. But it doesn't really tell us what the distribution of these two ranges are, right? You could have a range with 55% equity against one with 45, and there are countless possible distribution matchups that can produce those two range equities. So equity advantage in itself is not sufficient for us to say what strategy is going to be employed by the solver. Manuel said, maybe OP has a lot of medium hands, few air and few nuts. So that's similar to what Max answered, right? So if OP has like a shit ton of medium hands and just a slight amount of nuts, all of a sudden, if IP has any nuts, then all of the OP nuts are going to want to check because IP is going to bump a little bit different. I see. Give IP less nuts than 5%. Right. So now IP has only 5% nuts. So would it be 5% nuts and 95% air? If that's the case, then things may start to change, right? Because now with only 5% nuts and 95% air, what's going to happen is when OP checks with the top of his range, he can't really expect IP to push too much money into the pot, right? It's just 5% of very strong hands, which are going to need only a very small amount of bluffs to balance, and therefore villain is not putting out that much money into the pot for us. So it may be the case that OP's strongest hands start to put some money into the pot themselves. There's more to it. There's more to it that we need to figure out here. There are other things that are going to impact that strategy. Villain has a small percentage of air in the range, has a large percentage of nuts, and a large percentage of medium hands. When you say villain, you mean the IP player? Yeah, I see that you just typed that below. So if IP has a lot of nuts and a lot of medium hands, would it make sense for us to bet very small? Or in other words, which hands would benefit from betting very small against a range that has a lot of nuts? What do you think? Which hands would benefit from betting very small against a range that has a lot of nuts? Machia said, OP has the medium hands advantage. Both have nuts, both have air. So what you're saying is mostly the difference between a more condensed or merged range and a more polarized range, right? So if both ranges have nuts and air and only this guy has medium strength hands, then this range is a little bit more merged, contains more medium hands. And we all know that it only makes sense to have small bet sizes when you do have any medium strength hands in your range. So that's kind of a given, I guess. And it is correct. I forgot. OP must also have some air that it wants to bluff. Right. Yes. It needs to have bluffs as well. Otherwise, that bet size may not be effective enough in order to force villain to put money into the pot for us, as we're going to see in a minute. Rob Boss said, easy hands to fold against a raise. That is true. If you're constructing any betting range, you need to have a bet fold range, Otherwise, you're exploitable. Villain just going to raise for value and never bluff. So it is true that if you're developing a betting range and the SPR is big enough, of course, you're going to have a bet fold range. All right, so again, a lot of different answers. It may not be very clear exactly where the V comes from when you use those kinds of bets. So while we go through these examples, I want you to be always thinking about, okay, how can this strategic option generate EV from my range? What hands have their EV increased by having this strategic option available? That's how you're going to understand what needs to happen for that bet to make sense. If you can understand which hands benefit from that strategic option, then it's much easier for you to realize in what situations it would be a thing for that to happen or not, right? So we're going to take a look at a first example where these kinds of bets make sense. And we're going to take a look at the example. We're going to see the line in which it happens. And then I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think is the distribution of both players' ranges for this example? Right, so we're in a 3-bet pot here. Button opens 2.5. We 3-bet from the small blind. The flop comes queen 7 deuce rainbow. Right, the flop comes queen 7 deuce rainbow. I'm gonna put this down here. We have a strategy where we check 35% of the time, block bet 38% of the time, and bet half pot 26% of the time. We're gonna choose to block bet this time, and villain is going to raise. Against a block bet, villain is supposed to raise sometimes, around 13% of the time here. Mostly top pairs and then some bluffs, some 7x as well here. Stuff you guys are probably already familiar with. So villain raises, we're gonna call. So we're gonna have to continue a lot here with our bluff catchers. We're gonna have a lot of pocket pairs, a lot of queen X. We're gonna have to float some backdoor draws as well. So we see here king jack suited calling pretty much all the pretty much all the time with the backdoor flush draw. We have ace highs calling as well all the time with backdoor flush draw. All right, so we're gonna call. We're gonna have a blank turn. We see we have some leads here. Don't care about that lead for now. Then villain is going to have a bet check strategy. He's betting 2/3 of the time, checking 1/3 of the time. And then he's going to check back, and river is a 4. When we take a look at river 4 here, we see that our range contains a lot of these very tiny bets. So 23% of the time, we're going to be using that 10% bet. And there are some hands in our range that really prefer using that size over any other size. In fact, I guess the colors are not very distinctive here, so it's hard to see. But for example, a hand like pocket queens never wants to use other size, or it does use other size. So queens uses both, jacks uses both as well, it seems. All of these hands here that are bluff catchers, they're using the 10% sizing, and sometimes the 1/3 sizing here, 35% size. Right, so looking at this line, looking at this board, what would you guys, how do you perceive the distribution from both players' ranges here? Let's try to paint a picture of what's the distribution like for that position player here, and what's the distribution like for the AP player. Type there in the chat, what do you feel is the distribution for both players here? Try to talk mostly about the air, middling hands, and nuts, right? These are the 3 categories we're very concerned with. So what's the equity distribution for both players here in terms of air, middling hands, and nuts? And then we're gonna compare that in a second. In the ranges tab, we're going to see if you guys were close or not. We have more nuts, more middling hands, and less air, said Philip. I think that is correct, Philip, but try not to think in relative terms, try to think in absolute terms. Okay, so sometimes just the relative strength of certain parts of a range is not enough to understand the strategies. We need to know, for example, what's the absolute amount of air in your range. So if you say that you have more than your opponent or less than your opponent, it may not be sufficient to understand what's going on. You have to know exactly how much air you have. Is it a third of a range? Is it half of your range? If you have 5 and your opponent has 6, then maybe that's not really relevant enough, right? So the absolute terms is important. Joseph Adams said OP has 75% mid, 10% air, and 15% nuts. All right, so a very, very bluff catcher heavy range there with middling strength hands, very few air. Max said OP has 10% nuts, 65% medium hands, 25% air. And IP has 10% nuts, 30% middling strength, and 60% air. All right, so for both Max and Philip, it seems clear that IP has more air than OP in the situation, which makes a lot of sense given the line, right? The turn was a complete blank, and IP decided to check behind in a spot where he doesn't really need to slow play much. He's just concerned with maximizing the EV of the top of his range. So it makes sense to consider that the IP has a lot of air here, especially because the 4 doesn't really improve anything, right? The 4 is a very, very clear blank. Whereas OP, we're seeing in our face here, has a lot of these pocket pairs, a lot of Queen X. So the idea that OP has few air and IP has a lot of air, I think is certainly correct. Who else wants to give it a shot here? Now, one thing that is interesting about these kinds of nodes is that you're rarely going to see large bets. And if you think about it, the all-in sizing here is not even all that large, right? So going all in here is only a 93% pot bet. So it's less than the full pot. So for example, why do you guys think a hand as strong as ace queen here or aces is never shoving in the spot? So if you take a look at the equity of these hands, so aces has 93% equity, ace queen has 90, but these hands are never shoving, they're never putting all the money in. Why do you guys think that this is happening? What's the theoretical justification for this? Manuel said, just try to figure out the air parts. OP maybe only has 15% air. We're gonna take a look at that. Maybe a little bit more. We see there that there's a decent amount of king highs, and if you consider ace highs air as well, it's probably gonna be a bit more due to the amount of ace king off. But if you consider only the king highs, then it's probably around that. Philip said, we block villain's calling range for a big bet. Let's take a look at villain's check back range on the turn. So these are the hands that villain is checking back on the turn. He's gonna have some ace highs. He has some queen X, so a little bit of king queen, a very tiny amount of ace queen. He has pocket nines, pocket eights, pocket sixes, some pocket fives, 5-4 suited, and some 7x as well, 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited. So it is true that we're blocking a queen, but villain does have other hands to call off as well. These bluff catchers on this region here. What else are you guys saying? All the hands that would call all in as IP are jamming themselves. All hands that would call all in as IP are jamming themselves. Well, if that was the case, then we should always check our strong hands, right? If every single hand that villain calls an all-in with is jamming themselves, then we should just always check our strong hands, right? Because then we get value from all the hands that we would by betting, but we also get value from their bluffs, right? So that's probably not true that all hands that call are jamming themselves, because otherwise we would just always check the top of our range. People are seeing a lot of blocking villains calling range. Well, what about a hand like sevens, for example? Sevens is not blocking much of villains calling range, and yet it's almost pure checking here. So why would be that the case if blockers are not anymore the problem? We have a lot of medium straight hands and need nuts to protect that range, said Matias. Nice. We're going to be talking about the concept of protecting your range, right? This is something that I think we already covered. I think it was the last time we talked about this a little bit, but we're always going to be talking about that concept. It always comes back in some form of the other, right? But the whole concept of protecting your range needs to be taking, you need to be very careful with that concept, right? So putting very strong hands in your checking range happens because your hand is indifferent. Your hand makes exactly the same amount of money by betting or checking. And usually this can happen when you have a lot of medium straight hands, because when you have a lot of medium straight hands, your opponent is going to want to put money into the pot with his nuts and his bluffs, right? So the fact that you have a lot of medium straight hands make it so that when you check, your opponent puts money into the pot for you, which then increases the EV of checking with your strong hands, right? So there's always this balance of, okay, because I have bluff catchers, my opponent puts money into the pot for me, which benefits slow playing my strongest hands. Okay, so that's generally what's going to be happening in these situations. Very superficially, of course. I agree with Matthias, and probably we don't have enough air to polarize. Nice. That's another interesting consideration here. So basically what João is saying, well, we don't have enough bluffs to be able to size up. And if you ever end up in a situation like this, then that will be true. However, we know that the solver is always trying to play balanced ranges, right? The solver is always arriving at balanced ranges because that's the only way to maximize EV against a strong opponent. So if you ever miss value with the top of your range because you lack enough bluffs, then that means you constructed your range in a not sufficiently proper way on prior streets. And you can observe this concept in some very unusual lines that the solver plays, where sometimes the solver floats bets with air only to have the ability to have enough air on the next street. Okay, this happens in a few situations where if you just call bluff catchers, you never have bluffs on the next street. And because you're going to have a lot of nuts in the next street, you have to float some air in order to be able to balance that value region, right? So this happens at equilibrium sometimes. Max said IP range is relatively polarized and we make the most money with our nuts by checking and betting small, since villain will bet large for us and we can get value from IP's air. All right, so I think I got the idea here. Since IP is very polarized, then what we're trying to make money off from is villain's air, right? So if villain doesn't have many bluff catchers, how do you make money with the top of your range, right? Villain's gonna have some nubs himself, and because of blocker effects and probably splits, you don't make much money off of your opponent's top of range. So if villain doesn't have bluff catchers, then you have to try and come up with a way to make money off of his air, right? And that's absolutely correct. That's actually the premise of the Ace King Queen toy game. If you're here and you haven't watched the weekly coaching on the Ace King Queen toy game, then I definitely recommend that once you finish here this weekly coaching, you go back and watch that video, because that's probably the most important toy game in the entire game of No Limit Hold'em. All right. And those are not even my words. Those are the words of Bill Perkins in the Mathematics of Poker book, because that toy game definitely teaches a lot about the mechanics of the game. Right. So let's try and take a look first at the ranges, see if you guys came close to what's going on here. Right. So this is the equity distribution graph for both players' ranges. You can also take a look at the equity buckets and see what's going on. So take a look at the IP player first, which is the button here. That's as polarized as it gets, right? For most poker situations, you have a range that has 32% of very low equity hands. So hands here with 50% equity or lower. I don't think even that most hands get close to 50%. You see here a lot of hands with 31, 32, 30, 29, 28. So villain has a lot of weak hands, and he basically doesn't have middling strength hands. Particularly look at these three buckets here in the middle. He has 0 of those. So 0 of 50 to 60, 0 of 60 to 70, 0.8 of 70 to 80. And then he has around 28% of very strong hands. So at the top, he does have some strong hands. He has 22% of 80 to 90 and 6.7% of 90 to 100. So it's definitely a very polarized range, as you guys have already noticed before. No surprise. And when we take a look at the OP's range, we have something very, very different. Just by taking a look here at this part of the graph, you see that from 30 to, let me put this here, 30 to 75, so that's 45%, almost half of the opposition player's range here has this middling equity, right? Something between 50 to 75, which would be these two buckets here. So that's 43% of that opposition player's range. It has a decent amount of nuts as well, around 25%. And it has way less air than the IP player. It has around 30% air as opposed to 70%. Right? So you're going to see that in all situations that a 10% bet makes sense, this is exactly the kind of distribution that is going to happen for both players' ranges. You're going to have one player having a very, very high amount of air and very low amount of bluff catchers, and another range having a very, very high amount of bluff catchers, but also having some nuts and some air. Okay. And this is going to be, this distribution favors this 10% sizing because, first of all, of what we just said,